Genealogical Historical Society. I think it's a name that's very familiar to most of you. And tonight the talk is tracing your Scottish ancestors. I believe that some of you may have them, but I think you've come because David is a popular speaker, and I think this is great. So without any ado, please take a seat and let's enjoy the talk.
Thank you all for coming tonight. It looks like we've got practically a full house. I don't know if it's indicative of the subject matter tonight. I'm going to be talking about Scotland with kind of a general way. I'm going to be emphasizing those people whose ancestors came over in the 19th and 20th century. That's because it's the area that I'm most familiar with, and I think it's the easiest for people to do.
Not really.
If your ancestors came over in the 1700s and 1800s, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. Aside from woolen goods, and I'm wearing my Harris tweed jacket tonight, Scotch whiskey, probably Scotland's biggest export is people. Scotland, even today, has fewer people than we have here in Massachusetts. Even though the Scots keep producing people all the time, they keep exporting them also. There are probably many times the number of people in the United States alone who have Scottish ancestors compared to the number of people who actually live in Scotland today. And that's to say nothing of all of those people of Scottish descent living in Canada and other parts of the English-speaking world. People have been coming over from Scotland for centuries. I've listed here just a couple of the major periods of migration. The earliest to come to New England was in 1651 with the arrival of the Scots prisoners on the ship the Unity. Anybody have any ancestors that fall into that category? I've got two, as it turns out. I'm not really worried about tracing them back into Scotland. I probably will never find out where Malcolm Callum and Malcolm Downing came from, and I've got plenty of other ancestors at that time to worry about. Starting in the 17 teens, a large number of Scots came over to New England from Northern Ireland, and these are what we tend to call the Scotch Irish, or more precisely the Ulster Scots. These are people who descend from those Scots who were either enticed or bullied into leaving Scotland in the 1650s and moving to Northern Ireland by Oliver Cromwell. And by the early 1700s, some of them started becoming disillusioned with life in Northern Ireland, and they petitioned Governor Shute of Massachusetts to come here. A number of them settled in Londonderry, New Hampshire. Others went to various parts of Worcester County. Some went out to the Berkshires, and a lot of them went to Pennsylvania and the Carolinas. And there are a lot of people who descend from those. And if you do, that's a topic for another lecture, because your ancestors, even though they were Scottish, didn't come straight from Scotland. They came from Northern Ireland. So you've got to get your ancestors from here back into Northern Ireland, identify the parish that they came from, and if they came over in the early 1700s, they didn't start keeping records until the late 1700s. So there just isn't going to be anything. And then from there, you've got to get them back into Scotland. So what you're looking for are people who came straight from Scotland to America. When you get into the 19th century, a lot more people started coming over from Scotland. And not just to New England, but to other parts of the country and to Canada and elsewhere as well. I've mentioned here specifically what I call the Mill Scots, who mostly were poor people from the factory towns of Scotland who ended up coming over to the factory towns here in America, places such as Lowell and Lawrence, for example, which is what my people did. Others were people who were shepherds and farmers or crofters in the Highlands who were basically kicked out by the landlords in what was known as the Highland clearances. Those people, when they came over, tended to go to places like Nova Scotia, Ontario, or rural parts of the United States. I don't know how many of you have ancestors who fall into that category. You have a better chance of finding those people than you do the earlier ones. Although, if your ancestors came from the Highlands, just be warned that the pre-1850s records start later for the Highlands, so it's going to be a little bit more difficult. The other difficulty is that the Scots had such common names. In order to really find out where your ancestors came from, or to actually to trace them, you've got to really find a place in Scotland. That's sometimes easier said than done. You need to look at all of the possible records for your ancestor in this country. If they came over here as a single person, marriage and death records, newspaper obituary, naturalization record. Of course, that would only be if they came over after this country was created. If your ancestor came from Scotland or Northern Ireland to Canada, you're not going to find naturalization records because that would be considered an internal move within the British Empire. So you lose that type of record. Possibly a gravestone that might give you a place of origin. What was your ancestor's religion? If your ancestor belonged to the established Church of Scotland, which is the Presbyterian church here in this country, again, you have a better chance because most of the records that survive in terms of church records, or the ones at least that are the easiest to get, are those of the Church of Scotland, the Presbyterian church. Did your ancestor come over as part of a group? For example, the town of Andover, which is my hometown, there were two brothers by the name of named Smith, who got together with a guy named John Dove and established what was known as the Smith and Dove linen weaving factory on the Shawsheen River in Andover. They brought their technological know-how with them. This is during the Industrial Revolution. Well, once they built the factory, they needed factory workers. Well, they were not able to entice the local Yankee farmers into giving up farming to work in the factory weaving linen. So they ended up having to recruit people from their hometown of Brecon, Scotland, to come over. So a whole flock of these people came over, settled in Andover, all along the Shawsheen River, and it became quite a notable force or subgroup, say, within the community of Andover. Those are not the people who I descend from, but having grown up in Andover, I always was very familiar with this particular group of people. Naming patterns in Scotland are very important, especially when you consider that, like the Irish, Scottish people have very common names. If you go over to Scotland and you look in the phone book under James Campbell, I guarantee you're going to find pages of James Campbells. So having this little trick up your sleeve will help you. If you can identify your family group and remember these naming pattern rules. If you live in Scotland, I don't know if it's really quite true today, but right up into well into the 20th century, basically when you had a child, you didn't really have much, really had no choice in what your children's names were going to be. They were foreordained by your ancestors' names and by your names. If I were in Scotland, my name would not be David, my name would be Roy. I'm the eldest born son of my parents, so I would have been named for my paternal grandfather. My younger brother Peter would be named not Peter but William after our maternal grandfather. And I don't have any other brothers, but if I had a third one, that brother would have been named for my father, Everett. And for the girls, it's the exact opposite. My sister Deborah, her name should actually be Robina, after my maternal grandmother. If I had a second sister, her name would be Florence, after my other grandmother. And then a third sister would have been named for my mother, Dorothy. Now after that, after the fourth son or daughter and beyond, it gets a little looser. But for those first three boys and first three girls, those naming patterns are basically inflexible. So that if you know the names of the children of a couple, even if you don't know the names of that couple's parents, you can make a very, very good guess as to what their parents' given names would have been. And that might help you to break through some brick walls. And I can tell you, I've looked at family after family after family in my own background, and these naming patterns hold up time after time. It's a good idea before you start reinventing the wheel to see if anything is already in print. If you look at your handout, I have listed a variety of different books, and I list the Scottish Family History book here. But I can tell you, I wouldn't really worry about it because my people don't show up. That's because nobody had ever written them up before until I came along, and they probably wouldn't have been written up at all. Unless you come from a very prominent family, they probably are not going to appear. So it probably will be up to you to do the research. And of course, that's the fun part. One way to get a leg up on where the surname at least is located, realizing that Scottish names can be very common, is to look at this really neat website called gbnames.publicprofiler.org that I've listed here. This is a free website. And you can use this not just for Scotland, but for any surname in England, Wales, or Scotland. And what it is, it's based on, it shows you a surname distribution based on either the 1881 UK census or the 1998 British Telecom telephone directories. What they did is they were able to take the names and basically plot them on a map. So one of the principal names in my background is Wallace. And let's see. Not sure if it's showing up. The very southern part of that map, this area in here, this is actually England. This is the border between the two countries. Hadrian's Wall runs along there, so we won't worry about that. But you can see that the surname of Wallace is basically a southern Scottish name, southern and central part of Scotland, particularly in the southwestern area there. Ayrshire, Dumfries and Galloway, and then there's that little purple area up there in the eastern part over in the county of Fife. But when you get up into the northern and northwestern parts of Scotland, up into Inverness-shire and the Hebrides and the outer islands and the Shetlands, you can see that basically the name of Wallace is unheard of as of the 1881 census. Well, you might say, well, what good does that do me? My ancestors left in the 1700s. Well, that may be true, but remember that the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree. And even though your ancestors may have left Scotland a long time before, those who stayed behind, even though some of them would have moved around, they wouldn't have moved around all that much. This is not to show you exactly where your ancestor came from, but where that surname is clustered. Obviously, if you put in a really common name like Brown or Smith, they'll be everywhere. But some of the names, you'd think that, well, Wallace is a very Scottish name, and it is. But you can see that even within Scotland, that particular name is localized. And as it turns out, my family comes from southwestern Scotland, from the purple area, so mine are right smack dab where they're supposed to be. Now, this is a book which, once you've identified where your ancestors are from, can be very, very helpful in finding out about local records. It's called the Atlas and Index of Parish Registers. And I should add that all of the books that I've listed on the bibliography you can find at the library of the New England Historic Genealogical Society in Boston. They will have all of the titles that I've listed there. The area that I'm going to show you on the next map is the area of southwestern Scotland that I showed previously. And what this is just a part of Scotland. It's just one little corner of the country. And what this is doing, it's showing you all of the different parishes in Scotland prior to 1855, showing their boundaries, allowing you to find the parish that you're interested in, and seeing what the surrounding parishes are. I know it's probably a little hard to read from the back. And underneath the name of each parish is a date. That date is the year in which the earliest entry in the parish register of the Church of Scotland begins. So these vary considerably. I can't even read it on my own computer screen here. But you can take a look at this book for yourself. Now, you may be wondering what these colored areas indicate. Those indicate the boundaries of the various commissariat courts prior to 1825. This has to do with the leaving of wills and testamentary records. They don't call them wills in Scotland, but for probate records. If you lived and died within one of these areas, you would look in the local commissariat court for the area covered by that particular shaded area. And down in the bottom right-hand corner there, you can see the list of the various commissariat courts that are described on this particular map. So this can be very, very handy. And as I say, this is just one of a series of maps that covers all of Scotland, as well as England and Wales as well. What I'm showing you here is a page from a microfiche set known as the OPR Index. OPR stands for Old Parochial Registers. Prior to 1855, when civil registration began, that is the keeping of birth, marriage, and death records on a civil basis, the records were kept in the churches. And of course, the principal church was the established church, the Church of Scotland. And those records began at various times and go down to the end of the year 1854. And these are probably the primary means by which we trace genealogy. Of course, you may or may not know the parish. If you don't know a parish and don't mind looking, these microfiche exist. There's a set of them in Boston at the Library of the New England Historic Genealogical Society. And there are a separate series of these fiche for births and christenings and for marriages, nothing for deaths, mainly because they didn't keep very many death records to begin with. So you've got births, christenings, and marriages from the beginning to the end of 1854. And these are arranged county by county, not by commissariat, but by county. So if you have the fortitude, you could go through all of these and see if your ancestors show up. You can look for a birth or a christening record, or you can look for a marriage record. What I'm showing you here is an example of a marriage record. I'm not sure if the mouse is, oh, the mouse is working, okay. Not showing up on my screen here. The way that you read this is you've got over here, up at the top, it tells you that it's the county of Ayr. You can see up in the middle. We have the name of William Wallace, and then the various William Wallaces, who they married, the dates, and the place. And then this number over here, it says FR. That's very important. That is the frame number on the LDS roll of microfilm where you'll find that record. And that's important because sometimes the records were recorded out of chronological order. So in order to find them, you have to have the correct date. The numbers over here you don't need to worry about. So you can go through these, and these records are arranged in two ways. They're arranged not only by whether it's a birth, christening, or a marriage, but also by surname and by given name. And I'll show you the given name index in just a minute, and I'll explain why. So once you have found this, and you can see this marriage takes place in the parish of Dreghorn in the county of Ayr in 1770. With that, you should be able to acquire the church record itself and see what it tells you. So here's the record. This is what the original looks like. And, oops, I'm sorry. A little hard to read, but it says, if I remember, I can't really read it very easily myself. I think it says something like William Wallace of the parish of Rickerton. It's kind of hard to read. And Ann White of this parish hath given in their names for proclamation, married January 19th, 1770 is what it says up there in the highlighted part. Now that's very useful because it tells you that the groom and the bride were from two separate parishes. They got married in the bride's parish. The groom was from a place called Rickerton. which if you look at the map is right next to Dreghorn, so it makes sense. They got married in her parish. So you've learned a little fact there. Here is the Family History Library catalog. This is familysearch.org. I've listed this in your handout, how you would locate this particular record. Once you've identified the place that you want, if you want to see that record, you can go into familysearch.org. This is a free website. Go into their catalog, type in by place, and it lists it there. And then it lists the film number. Now, until about a year or so ago, you used to be able to order these microfilms for a small fee. They discontinued that about a year ago. But what they've done now instead is they've digitized the records. And I did this screenshot from home. And you'll see the little camera icon here. That means that the record has been digitized. However, see the little key right above it? That means that that record is restricted. You cannot see that record from home. In order to see the actual record, that is this, you need to go to either a Latter-day Saints Family History Center or to a library which is affiliated with the Family History Library of Salt Lake. And as far as I know, the Chelmsford Public Library is a Family History Center. You need to do this on one of their computers because Salt Lake City will recognize the library's IP address. And then you can actually see the records here, okay? So, but if you are at home and you do this and there is no key, then you can see the image right at home. It depends upon the record. The other thing that I will point out to you is, where is it? Oh. See where it says notes? And it says microfilm of OPR manuscript number 589. Those numbers are important. Each parish in Scotland is given a number. Scotland has, I think, just under 1,000 parishes. If you're starting with parish number 1 way up in the Shetland Islands and going down to parish 995 or something way down on the English border. So these numbers are just arbitrary, but these numbers work for every type of record pertaining to that particular parish. We're talking here about the pre-1855 church records. But once you get into civil registration, the parish of Dreghorn, those records will still be listed as 589. When you're looking at census records for Dreghorn, it's going to be parish 589. So if you have a lot of people in a certain parish, it's useful to find the parish number because it helps you to find the records a little quicker. Here's what a baptismal record looks like from that period. It obviously depends upon the quality of the clerk's handwriting. This happens to be for Rickerton. This is the firstborn son. It says Rickerton, August 25th, 1771. This day, William, son of William Wallace and Ann White, was born 23rd and baptized Rickerton, September 8th, 1771, I believe, and then below are the names of witnesses. Now, one thing that you'll note there is on the birth record, it identifies both the father and the mother is still called Ann White. She retains her maiden name. Unlike where you're looking in England and you might find a record, it might just say son of William and Anne, or even worse, it might just say son of William. So it doesn't really tell you very much. This way you know you've got the birth of the very same couple whose marriage we saw just a little bit earlier. Here we have a shot of the OPR Index where it's arranged by given name. So I've listed here the birth records of various women in the county of Lanarkshire by the name of Robina, all listed not alphabetically by their last name, but chronologically by their date of birth, but sorted by their first name. Well, you might say, why do they bother to do that? Well, that's because the names are transcribed exactly as they're spelled. And you take a name, say like McCullough. It can be spelled about a half a dozen different ways. And unless you can think of them all, you might miss an entry if you were looking through just the surname index. So by looking under, if you can't find the person you want, by looking through the given name part, you may be able to identify the actual person that you're looking for. I wanted to digress just for a second to explain why the OPR index exists in the first place. The original OPR records are kept in books. And those records are kept in Edinburgh at New Register House. And back in the early 1950s, the Latter-day Saints were permitted to go in and microfilm these books, which they did. But when they did them, they just simply laid the book flat on the table and opened it up like this and filmed. And unfortunately, some of the books were rather tightly bound, and some of the writing was invisible because it was down inside the gutter of the book, or the pages were out of focus. Well, the Mormons kind of stewed on this for several decades, and then they went back to the folks in Scotland and said, we'd like to refilm the books. But this time what we'd like to do is cut the backs off them so that we can lie the pages completely flat. Well, needless to say, the folks in Scotland were not very keen on this idea, but they saw the wisdom of it. And being the canny Scots that they were, they thought, we're going to get something out of this for ourselves. So they said, okay, we'll make a deal with you. We will allow you to do this, but you have to index them all. And that's why we have the OPR index, okay? So because now a lot of the stuff is on the computer, although not everything. You still need to look at the OPR index. Not everything is online. Well, that's why this came into existence. And here we have the actual birth or baptismal record, I should say, of Robina in 1839 here, the one whose example I showed you. You can see the handwriting is considerably clearer. Here we have, it says Alexander Ross Smith. Now, his name wasn't Alexander Ross Smith. His name was Alexander Ross. His occupation was Smith. He was a blacksmith. And Elizabeth Wallace, a lawful daughter, in other words, not one born out of wedlock, a lawful daughter, Robina, baptized the 4th of March, and then it names the two witnesses, James Wilson and James Bigg. So not a lot of information, but enough. Now, a lot of this you can do from home. There is a website known as scotlandspeople.gov.uk, and I've listed this in your handout. This is the official website for the vital records for Scotland, of the Scottish government. This is a site you can go on to. You can look at the various indexes for free. You need to register to use it, but there's no charge. The only charge is if you want to actually see a record. And what you can see on here, you can look at the pre-1855 OPRs. You can look at the post-1855 civil registration records, that is the civil records of births, marriages, and deaths. You can look at the censuses. You can look at valuation records, which are like tax rolls. You can look at wills down to a point. You can look at military wills, and if, say, a soldier is about to go to war. And you can look at heraldic records, which I'm not really going to get into. That's where the money comes in. You can buy credits at the rate of, I think, 25 pence per credit. And then every time you click to see a record, ka-ching, ka-ching, it deducts that value from the money you put into your escrow account. So if you just need to look up a few records, it's not a bad deal. It's a lot cheaper than a plane ride and a hotel bill over in Scotland. There are some restrictions. If you're looking at the civil registration records, you can look at the indexes to your heart's content, but you cannot download or view any birth that is less than 100 years old, any marriage that's less than 75 years old, or any death that's less than 50 years old. Well, you might say, well, my people are way, way back anyway, so that doesn't really affect me. Well, then that's great for you. I'm interested in taking my Scottish people and going not only back this way, but coming down this way. So I run into this brick wall of there are people who were born in the 1880s. They're still alive into the 1940s and 50s or whatever, and I want to be able to kill these people off. I want to actually see their death record or whatever. So you've got to go to Scotland in order to do that. But for what it is, it's a great deal. You can do an awful lot of stuff. But before you do this, try to look at the free stuff first. As I say, if Family Search already has records, you want to do that before you start doing this, okay? So I'm going to talk about some of the workarounds. But first, a little bit more about the Scotland's people. This explains a little bit about how much it costs for the various types of records and so forth. And then you can do your search. So here I'm doing an imaginary search for a marriage record for a couple named Alexander McPherson and Robina Ross. Now, I already know what the results are going to be, so I could have just done a kind of a wild card thing, but I put in their names. I happen to know that their marriage was recorded in 1863. They were actually married December 31st, 1862, and I know that it happened in Lanarkshire. And if I got too many hits, I could even narrow down the specific registration district. Well, I just left the thing open. So when I click on this doesn't cost anything to do this, so you can do this from home. And it comes up with, there they are, just the one hit, and it gives their names, the year 1863, and then where it says ref 644/4, that's the registration district, and then the 34 is the number of the record, and then the RD name is the name of the actual physical name of the district. And then over at the right there where it says buy credits, well, I don't have any, but if I did, this is what I get. So this is what the civil registration looks like. And there are two marriage records per page. The one I want is the one highlighted down at the bottom. And there's the kind of information that you get from it. In this case, date and place of the marriage, the names of the two parties, their ages, in this case, their street addresses. This happens to be in Glasgow. Now, if they lived in a little town, you're not going to get as specific as a street name. The names of their parents: he is the son of Angus McPherson, police constable, deceased, and Ann McPherson, maiden surname McCallum. She is the daughter of John Ross, blacksmith, deceased, and Elizabeth Ross, maiden surname Wallace. And then over here it says married. It says signed James Aitken, minister, St. Luke's. And then the witnesses. And the Ann McPherson, I think, is the same as the woman who's his mother up there. So that's what you'd get from a marriage record. So it's quite a bit of information. And the form of these records is the same well into the 20th century. In fact, just down to about maybe 20 years ago, they used these very same forms. Here's what a death record looks like. This is from 1863 for a lady named Robina Ross. And in this case, a little of the data was missing. We get her name over there at the left. It says she's the widow of William Wallace Bleacher, her date of death and where she died. She's a female. She was 89. She's the daughter of James Pender, deceased, so her maiden name would have been Pender. And then for mother, it just says blank Pender, maiden surname blank, so they didn't know who she was. She died of dysentery, from which she had suffered for 1 week, and the informant who signs over here is her son, James Wallace. So again, a fair amount of information depending upon what was known in the family. But that's not bad for the 1860s. Here's a woman who's nearly 90 years old. She was born around 1770, and we have the name of her father. So to me, that's pretty remarkable. This shows you if you have ancestors from the larger cities. I said that each parish has a number. Well, in the case of Glasgow, the city of Glasgow, which is where most of my people either lived or ended up, that's parish number 644. But because it's so large, they had to break it down into smaller jurisdictions. So just like a city like Lowell is going to have different wards, Glasgow is the same way. So you have 644/1, 644/2, and so forth. And over time, just as the ward boundaries in a place like Lowell might change as the city grew and evolved, the same thing happened in Glasgow. So this shows you these were the names and boundaries of the various registration districts in Glasgow for this particular 18-year period, after which they kept tweaking them around here or there. Now, if you are looking for any birth, marriage, or death in Scotland that occurred between 1855, when the records begin, and 1875, those records have all been microfilmed and digitized by the Mormons. You don't have to go through the Scotland's people. And the good news is it costs $0 to see those records. They're all free. That's a pretty crucial time period. That's when a lot of our people were coming over. So what you need to do, you can probably, rather than do this is showing you in the Family History Library catalog, which you get at, as I showed you, on familysearch.org, and go into, type in place in the catalog, and then just scroll down to where it says civil registration. You can use the Scotland's People site to get, I try to identify the name of the person or people that you're looking for, and get the particulars on the year, the registration district, and the certificate number. And then you can order them. This happens to be a page from their index showing the general index for births of males starting in 1855 with the roll numbers. And you can see that they've all been digitized, but you need to do these at a family history center in order to look at them. Now, if you know the parish number, you don't need to go through these indexes cover all of Scotland, by the way. You can go directly to the parish. Here I've listed a screenshot showing just births in the Scottish county of Angus. And each one of these records represents the contents of one roll of microfilm, which has now been digitized, except for one oddball up there. I don't know why. And you can see here, for each one of these, here I'm looking at the last one, it says Angus County births, parish numbers 269 to 281. You can see how these numbers go to a point, and then for the next year they start to repeat. We're down here to the year 1860. So if you know that, let's say your parish that you want is maybe 273, you'd know that this is the one that you'd want to click on, and then you'd have to scroll through the images to get to parish 273. And at the beginning of each parish will be an alphabetical list of the births for that year, and you can get the exact certificate number if you don't have it already, and then go to that actual certificate. So it's really nifty that you can do that. Another thing you can do with Family Search is you can do what I call a parent search. When you go into search, the first thing most people do is they go into where the name is, and you put in the name of the person you're looking for. But let's say you want to know, did that person have any brothers or sisters? And you know who the parents are. What you can do is, over here in the search part, is where it says first name, last name, way up there in the upper left. Leave that blank. But down below, put in the parents' names, Alexander McPherson and Robina Ross. And just leave the top part blank. Then click on search, and this is what you get. So we can see here we have the names of several different children of that couple. All right, it may not be all of them, but at least all the ones who show up who would have been born in Scotland between 1855 and 75, or at least that Salt Lake has a record of, are going to appear with the specifics over there. And because these are all within the magic period, I can actually go and look at their actual birth certificates, okay? Let's move on to the census now. Just like we have census here in the United States, they did the same thing over in the UK. And this is one case where Scotland and England are in lockstep. The censuses are identical. They give the exact same information, whether you're looking in England or in Scotland. The first year that the census survives for Scotland and England is 1841, a lot later than what we're used to here. But as you'll see, their censuses have certain questions on them that give much more information than the American censuses do. The most recent that you can see at this point is 1911. You can only see the 1911 either by going to Scotland or seeing it on the Scotland's People website. Other sites, such as particularly Ancestry.com, have the information, but only down to the 1901 census. In fact, for those of you who either have a subscription to Ancestry.com or use it here at the library, finding somebody in the Scottish censuses, Ancestry.com's Scottish census search is the best by far in terms of finding people. It's much better than what the Scots have in Scotland. So I'll show you what the censuses look like. Here is the 1841 census, the very first one. This is the least helpful by far, but it still might be necessary for you if your family left before 1851. If they were still there in 41, but they left in the 40s, you might have to resort to that. So here we have the family of Alexander Ross and Elizabeth, his wife, and their 2 children. And it really gives minimal information. It gives their names, doesn't tell you how they're related to each other, but it's kind of inferred. It gives their ages, with the males in the left column, the females in the right column, occupation, and then you see this Y. That is an answer to the question of, were you born in this county where you were living, yes or no? So this is Glasgow, which is Lanarkshire, and they say, yes, we were all born in Lanarkshire. So you can, of course, do the arithmetic and figure out approximately when these people would have been born. And in the case of city dwellers, you get street address. So it's not the greatest, but it may be the best that you can do. Starting in 51, and then continuing right through 1911, you get an awful lot more information. Here's a page from the 61 census. I really like this because it's an extended family group. This is still in Glasgow, and we have the names of the various people over there, headed by Robina Wallace. She's the lady whose death record we saw just a couple of minutes ago, who died in 1863. Well, here she is 2 years before her death in 1861. She is described as the head of the household. She's a widow. She's 87. Remember, she was 89 when she died 2 years later. And then way over here, this is the kicker. It gives her place of birth, Lanarkshire, Bothwell. Bothwell is the exact place where she was born, so it gives you the county and the parish. So with that, in theory, I should be able to go back to the parish register and find her baptism. Unfortunately, it's not there. But then here are the names of various other members of her household: daughter, son, 3 grandchildren, and a servant. And what's interesting is it doesn't tell you, but I happen to know the servant is actually a relative too, even though it doesn't say so, with their names, how they're related to the head of the household, their marital status, ages, occupations, and then precise places of birth. So it's much more useful than the American censuses for the same period of time. And as I say, these are the indexes to these are available on ancestry.com, but not the actual images. You can get the images on Family Search or from the Scotland's People site. Okay? Here's a screenshot of a page from ancestry.com. This happens to be of the one of the censuses here. I think it's 1891, I think it is, for someplace, I think it's in Scotland. It's Govan and Lanarkshire, which is a suburb of Glasgow. And this is all that you get from Ancestry, but it basically is all of the information that you'd find. So we have the family of William Martin and the various members of his household. But you can click on any one of these individuals, and it will give you all of the information for that person and tell you how they're related to the head of the household. So basically, it's a complete transcription. So in this case, you really don't need the microfilm. I always like to look at it if I can. But basically, on Ancestry, you can find the people without very much difficulty, providing that you have at least some basic information on the names. And of course, for those of you who are familiar with Ancestry.com, when you find a person in a record like this, sometimes it will give you hints that we think that this is the same person who appears in other censuses, in other records, what have you. Okay, which of course you don't get normally on other sites. Let's move on now to probate records. These may or may not be helpful to you. It depends, of course, on the relative status or relative wealth of your ancestors. None of my early ancestors left wills or testaments, as I say, as far as I know, but they always should be looked for. Prior to 1825, the records are arranged according to the commissariat courts, as I said. Between 1825 and 1876, there were local sheriff courts, and then after that, they were kind of filed nationally. And there are different indexes for the different time periods. If you're interested in the period before 1800, there are printed indexes to all of the testamentary records in a series of books published by the Scottish Records Society. And NEHGS in Boston has a full set of these. This is a shot of a title page from one of these books. And then, of course, it's simply going to list the people in there. I think I showed there also is on scotlandspeople.gov, there's a free index that you can look at as well. It goes right down into fairly modern, yeah, right down to 1925. That probably is the easiest way to find people. For the period from 1876 to 1936, this probably is going to be too late for a lot of you, there are these annual printed volumes, and I think these are on Ancestry. I think they've digitized these, where this is just the index, but look at how much information it gives. That's just the index. It's wonderful. It really gives you a tremendous amount. You can see this person obviously is worth over 9,000 pounds when he died in 1880. This guy was worth a lot of money. He did pretty well. But it gives you, quite a bit of information. And then you can, as I say, you can get the will from scotlandspeople.gov. And then for the period in between, you get these types of indexes here. But as I say, you really don't need to worry about these because you can use the Scotland's People site. There's no charge to search the index for the wills. It's only if you want to see them. If your ancestor owned property, these records can be useful, what are known as Secession or Secession Records. These are published abridgments to them, which Salt Lake City has on microfilm. I'm not sure if these have been digitized or not. These turned out to be crucial for me because when I was looking for this William Wallace originally, this is before the censuses were indexed back in the 90s. I couldn't find him in the census in Glasgow. But when I found this record here, if you look at the second Secession, it says he was living in a place called Shandon in Dunbartonshire, which is maybe about 20, 30 miles west. So I tried looking there in the 51 census, and there he was. And that identified his birthplace as Rickerton. That's what led me back to that, was this record. If I hadn't found it, I would have been stuck. So these can be useful. These are a little sort of hard to tell exactly what they're saying here. They're using this heavily abbreviated legal language here, but it has to do with this piece of property in this place called Burnbank in Glasgow, which we'll see in a little bit. For those of you who are looking for cemetery records, NEHGS in Boston has an excellent collection of transcriptions of cemeteries that have been done by the Scottish Genealogy Society in Edinburgh. We don't have all of them, and there are local societies over there that do this as well. This is just an example of one. Particularly if you plan a trip to Scotland and find an ancestor who's in here and you'd like to see the stone, this can save you an awful lot of bother. You can find out first if a stone exists and then where it is. So these folks that I've listed up there, that I've highlighted, those are not my ancestors. I'm just doing this by way of example. So you can see that each grave is numbered just kind of arbitrarily with the information transcribed from the stone. And then for each one, there'll be a little map of the cemetery showing you exactly where that stone is. So with that, if you were to go over there, you could walk right into that churchyard and go right into that corner and see those stones for yourself. And this is the great thing to do. This is a cemetery in Glasgow, which of course, it's like going to Boston. It's a huge city, and there are a lot of cemeteries, and the cemeteries themselves are huge. This particular cemetery had over 130,000 burials in it just by 1900 alone. There's a lot more now. So I spent days walking around this place, and unfortunately, you can't really see, well, you can see a lot of the stones have been tipped over either by vandals or the stones themselves get teetery. So the staff tips them over on purpose just so that nobody will get hurt. It's sort of hard to tell what's what in there. But I was very lucky in able to find the record. Anybody with Glasgow ancestors in the 19th century? Okay, a couple of you. The one bad thing about the death records in Scotland, when you're talking about civil registration, give a lot of information. They don't tell you where the person's buried. Sometimes you can get that from the newspaper. Newspaper might tell you. And if you've got people in Glasgow, the Glasgow Herald has all been digitized, and you can get it for free on Google News, and that might give you the name of the cemetery. Otherwise, if you know where in Glasgow they lived, you could look on a map, find the street, see what large cemetery is nearby, which is what I did. I knew my people lived in what's called the east end of town, which is the bad part, of course. And so I looked, and it's like Eastern Necropolis. Let me start with that one, and there they were. So I was able to get this record out of the city of Glasgow. But then I discovered that the Mormons have microfilmed all the cemetery records for Glasgow, for the city cemetery. So I was able to find, there are two types of records that they keep. They keep a day-by-day log that's just chronological of everybody who they buried. And though there are no indexes to it, but if you have a date of death from civil registration, you can go to that and find the particulars of that person. First of all, see if they're there. And then what you need to do is you need to find out either the certificate number or the lair number. In this case, the lair number, you can see right under the name, it says lair numbers 408, 4008, 009, and 010. And they're in compartment 5. Now, a compartment would be what we would call a section of the cemetery. I remember when I went out there and got hold of the superintendent, he kept saying to me, "Laddie, what's your compartment number?" And I didn't know what he was talking about. But I eventually did. So here I was able to get the names of all the people who are buried in that particular lair, or lot, as we would call it. And then with that, I was able to tramp the cemetery and find the stone. So in this case, this is just the side. The main name is on the front. This is just the parents, the person who put it up. He's the guy that had the 9,000 pounds who died in 1880. So he was able to put up this very large, nice, elaborate stone. And you can see down below, here's the Robina Pender who died in 1863. There she is. So that was the highlight of one of my trips to Scotland, was finding that particular monument. It was a real thrill. On the other hand, I found plenty of other people who were in the same cemetery, and I've got the exact compartment, the exact lair, and when I walk out there, there's nothing but grass. But you know, that's just the way it goes. So you never know. At the National Library of Scotland's website, they've got a lot of neat old maps. And so with this, I was able to go through and find maps of Glasgow for various periods of time. And this is just where I zoomed into one little tiny section of the city where my people happened to live. And this particular map was from the 1890s. And over on the right is up on the right there is the house. And they ran this bleachery, which is over on the other side of the railroad tracks. You can see these tracks running through here. Then you can see up in the upper left is a canal, or actually an aqueduct that ran along. What's interesting about this is by looking at this and comparing it to a modern map, you can superimpose one on top of another. And that's what it looks like today. That's from Google Earth. And you can see the railroad is still there, but the aqueduct has been replaced by an expressway, rather interestingly. But all the buildings that were in that other shot are totally gone. The bleach works, it probably would be a Superfund site today, but instead it's now housing, what they call council housing, which is basically a housing project on both sides. And of course the old house, of which a cousin of mine, who I didn't know until I got into genealogy, a third cousin who lives in Florida, she actually had a picture of the old house. She descends from that James Wallace, the one that had the 9,000 pounds, who put up the stone. I descend from his sister, who was quite poor, on the other hand, naturally. So it was interesting to go there, and actually, even though there was really nothing to see, but to go there and just walk around this rather drab neighborhood in the east end of Glasgow, and thinking that this is where my ancestors lived 150 years earlier. It was really, to me, just a thrill. And this is where the old maps comes in handy, because the name of Burnbank, you ask people now, they don't know what Burnbank is. And that was the name of this little area back in the 1800s, but that name is totally gone now. And you say Burnbank, and they just kind of shrug and have no idea. So you really have to look at the old maps and study them, because sometimes the place names change and evolve. Now, it may not be for everybody, but if you can possibly get to Scotland, I highly recommend it. First of all, it's just a wonderful country. It's very scenic. It's very different from here. But it may be that if you're trying to do the sort of research that I'm doing, it really is actually more cost efficient. The last time I was over there, I spent 2 weeks. This is a year ago. And between my wife and myself, we transcribed over 600 birth, marriage, and death records. It's the Scotland's People Centre. And if you were to download them at 6 credits a piece, which is £1.50 the last time I knew, that in real money, if you will, American money, that'd be about $2 a pop. So that'd be $1,200 right there. And the thing is, that doesn't allow for all the false hits I get. Let's say I'm looking for the birth of a George Thompson, okay? Either with or without the P. And all I know is he probably was born sometime around, I don't know, 1915, probably in Glasgow. There are going to be dozens of them. I could do this from home, but every time I click on one, if I don't, and the thing is, you look in the birth index isn't going to give you the parents' names. You've got to look at the actual record to see. So every time I click, it's, ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. Wrong George, wrong George, wrong George, wrong George. There he is. But in the meantime, I've whipped through $20, $30 just like that, finding him. Whereas if I go over there, when you go into the Scotland's People Centre, which you can almost see in this photograph up at the right there, you pay £15 per day, which is like about $20 or so. It seems like a lot, but how much do you pay to go to the movies or play around at golf or whatever? They set you up at a computer. I should probably show you. There's Register House from the outside. I took that about 6:30 on a Sunday morning, which is why there's no traffic. This is on one of the busiest streets in Edinburgh. On a weekday, it's very hard to cross the street with all the traffic. This explains a little bit about the deal here. And this is what you get. You go in there, and they set you up at one of these computers, and that terminal is yours for the day. And you can look at whatever you want, as many records as you can. You're not allowed to use a camera. You have to copy everything by hand, or you can download things, I think, for, I don't know, 10 or 15p per page, 10 or 15 pence per page, but only records, as I said, births 100 years old or older, marriages 75 years, and so forth. But anything more recent, you can see them. You just can't copy it except by hand. Okay? I have birth records right down to 2016. These people don't know I exist, but I've got the goods on them. Okay? So I've got something like 160-something places in there. This was a fairly average day. I guess it was kind of quiet. This was in, I think it was June when we were there a year ago, is what you get. So for me, it was well worth paying the airfare, going over there, staying in a bed and breakfast for a couple of weeks, and enlisting my wife when I could get her to put the shopping and the sightseeing aside to come in and help me out. And we just scribbled like mad. I've done that any number of times. Plus, I just love going to Scotland anyway. It's just a great place. You might also want to go out to the places where your ancestor lived. There might be local libraries that are going to have things that you won't find other places. This is the Mitchell Library in Glasgow. It's the largest public library in Europe. It's a magnificent building. And they have a very nice, for those of you with Glasgow or west of Scotland ancestors, they've got a very nice genealogy room in there, although I was a little surprised when I looked at their rolls of microfilm of various parish registers. They were all things that the Mormons had microfilmed. But that's the way it goes. But they had a lot of original records too. And for those of you with Glasgow ancestors in the 19th century, the one thing they have which is really useful is the poor records, the poor law records. There are a lot of people like my ancestors who were on poor relief in the 19th century. And these records only exist at the Mitchell Library. Other cities may have them for their areas. And this is a page for one of my great-great-grandparents. You probably can't read all of that, but the genealogical detail on there is amazing. I already knew everything that was on there, but it's just so wonderful to see it all confirmed. It's just an amazing, amazing thing. So these are all there at the Mitchell, and many other things too. And while you're in Edinburgh, you may want to pop over to the Scottish Genealogy Society, which is not too far from Edinburgh Castle. It's on this rather unprepossessing little alleyway. It's the very first door on your right. You can see that it would be kind of easy to miss. Those of you who are familiar with the New England Historic Genealogical Society in Boston, it might seem like kind of a letdown, but this is what they have for Scotland. And they're very, very friendly in there, and it's kind of cramped. It's very bomb-proof, as you can see. The building is built like a fortress, but they have a very nice library in there, and it's a very good place to stop in and check out. And of course, while you're there, you should avail yourself of the local nightlife as well. There are many, many places to eat and drink. This is a pub that my wife and I like very much. We just happened to be there one night when I think they were watching a football game, as they call it over there, or something on the telly. Edinburgh is just a very, very nice city. I think at the very end of the handout, I've listed some little hints for those of you who might be considering a trip over there. It's a very easy city to get around. It's much smaller than Boston. They have an excellent public transportation system. There are a lot of reasonable bed and breakfasts where you can go, lots of places to eat, shop, and do, and just a great place to go. So with that, I'm going to fold my tent here, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have. Yes.
My ancestors also came from Ayrshire. The first time I went over, I didn't get old. Went to the Ayrshire City Library, so anybody has with the Ayrshire
Yes.
City Library.
Yes. Yeah. The person was remarking about the Ayr Public Library in the city of Ayr, which I've been to also. I've got Ayr people, very, very nice, and others of you may have similar experiences with libraries and archival resources in other cities in Scotland. Anybody else? Yeah.
My mother's family was Davidson, and I can trace them back to County Down. They were an Ulster Scott family that the farthest back I can get is a William Davidson, who was born around 1750. Is there any information on the people, the Davidsons, that might have come from Scotland to County Down, for example?
I don't really know, but I think I would probably want to check in Belfast, I think is what I would want to do. I'd probably want to go to the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland for anything like that if I were looking for people in County Down. We have some information at HistGen on County Down. I know we've got a lot of County Down cemetery inscriptions and things like that, but because what you're basically trying to do is get from there back into Scotland. If you haven't done so, I think the first thing I would do would be to run the name of Davidson through the surname profiler website. They're the GB names, just to see if Davidson itself is peculiar to just certain parts of Scotland. That at least might allow you to narrow down. But the difficulty is that if you say you're back to around 1750, still in Ulster, they might have been in Ulster, back 100 years before that. And then you've got to get, so you don't even have the name. So it's really going to be difficult, other than to say, well, Davidson is a big name in Ayrshire, say, and of course Ayrshire, on a clear day, you can see Northern Ireland. It's only about maybe 20, 30 miles across the water. To say they probably are, most of the people who went to Ulster were from southwestern Scotland. They were from that area. They weren't from the northeast. Beyond that, it's not much you can do.
Yeah, I was in Edinburgh in September at the Great Register House, and traced some ancestors back to 1835 in East Lothian, Scotland. But I'm trying to find out when they emigrated, And they said, well, we don't have the records here, you have to go to London for that. And it's like, well, I can't make it to London, so is there any other way to really
Well,
get that information?
well, you certainly must know approximately when they show up here.
Well, I know around like when they were in New Brunswick, because they went to New Brunswick, Canada.
Oh, okay.
And then I know, you know, I just don't know when they left, and I'm trying to find out.
Yeah, if they, are you talking like the early 1800s
I'm
or?
talking about like they're in the Scotland census in the 41 and 51, by 61 they're gone.
Okay, so it's sometime in that decade.
Yes.
Well, there is a 61 census for New Brunswick. I'm just wondering if they show up there, so at least you know it's definitely within that 10-year. I mean, it probably is. The problem is that they weren't keeping records. There really is no point in going to London. At least for this. The British were not keeping records of people leaving the British Isles at that time, especially if they were going to basically what was a colony, New Brunswick. It was just an internal move within the British Empire. I think Canada did have records, and it's my understanding that they destroyed them. They got rid of them. They thought, why do we bother to keep these? So I think all you can do is say that they, well, first of all, if you've got them in the 41 census, I don't know whether they had any kids after that you could say, well, they still were here as late as like say 43 because I've got the birth of little Archibald, you know, Smith or whatever. Then I find the family in 61, and you might be able to work that back a little bit from the New Brunswick end. I don't know if they owned property or anything, or something in a church record, you know, something local in New Brunswick where you might be able to narrow down. But I think the best you're going to be able to do is to say they came over sometime in this window.
Okay.
I think is the best you're going to be able to do. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, sir.
How common is McPherson? I see. Is it?
It's very common.
Yeah.
McPherson is like a lot of Scottish names. Is very generic. It just means son of the parson or son of the preacher is all that
You're
it
from
means.
the eye of the sky here.
Yes. Well, that's where a lot of them are from. The clan McPherson. Well, they started in Kingussie and Inverness-shire, but they're very big in the Hebrides. I don't think my people are connected to them. Mine, the earliest I can go back to is down in Perthshire. Mine are down in the place called Ochtergavin, which is probably about 30, 40 miles south. I
Is the
don't
eye
think
of the
they're
sky near Glasgow? Is that?
No. Isle of Skye.
Because they went to Glasgow before they came over.
Well, they probably would have, because they wouldn't have gone directly from Skye. They had to get to Glasgow, and they actually would have sailed out of a place called Greenock, which is the port of Glasgow. The Isle of Skye, if you looked at that map I had at the very beginning, is way out in the Hebrides, those islands that are way off the west coast. The Isle of Skye is in the middle. The main ones are Harris and Lewis, but Skye is in there, Benbecula. Skye was a very, very big place to jump off from. I've never been to the Hebrides. They're beautiful, but there's not much there. It's a pretty tough living. So in order to get from there to here, they would have gone down to Glasgow somehow and then come over. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So we've always been Irish and a whole bunch of other fun things too. So, and then McGonagall is on my father's side. And then my dad went to Scotland, and they're like, oh yeah, no, you must be Scotch because you know McGonagall's. And so my great, however many grades back, came from Donegal around 1840. Is he likely Scottish through Ireland, or is he more likely to be Irish?
Hard to say. I think the first thing you could do, I'm not sure whether McGonagall is Scottish or Irish, but I think I'd put it into the GB Names website and just see, are there McGonagalls in, well, McGonagall can be spelled in a number of different ways. McGonagall with a U, right. Were they Protestant?
Probably not.
Yeah, okay. Now there are Scottish Catholics. Not very many. They tend to be out in the outer islands. I think basically what you have to do is work from the known to the unknown. You've got to work with what you know in County Donegal and go from there and just see what you can find. One thing, of course, you could do, I don't know if they use the Scottish naming customs, if you have any inkling that they might have done that when they named their kids.
There's a whole lot of Williams.
Right, well, what happens is because they used this naming pattern that I showed, the same names are going to repeat over and over again. And if it's a name like William, it's not good because it's such a common name.
It's everybody's name.
Right, in my case, I said that my sister, who was the first and only daughter in my family, she would have been named for her maternal grandmother, who was Robina. That was my maternal grandmother's name. My grandmother, in turn, was the oldest daughter in her family. She was named for her maternal grandmother, Robina Ross, who in turn was the oldest daughter in her family. So she was named for her maternal grandmother, that Robina Pender, whose death record you saw and whose name you saw on the gravestone. So it repeats every other generation. So Robina's not that common a name, but it proliferates through my family. And every daughter named their first daughter Robina, and every son named their second daughter Robina. So I have Robinas all over, but with William, of course, it's very difficult. So you just have to kind of play with that.
Just curious.
All right, yeah.
He went
Yeah.
to Scotland last year, and all of a sudden he's like, "Oh, I don't know, we're Scottish." I'm
Right.
like, "No, sorry."
It could be. I don't really know. And of course, Donegal is in Ulster, so it's possible. It's possible. You just would have to look into that. But my suggestion would be probably going to need to go to Belfast sometime and play with that. Go to the what's called PRONI, the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, is where you'd want to go. Right. So, yes.
So daughter number 1 was Mary Sophia, and daughter number 2 was Mary Ann. Would the Sophia and the Ann be the ones you'd be looking at?
No, because maybe the mother's mother was Mary Sophia, and the father's mother was Mary Ann. That could be. You'd have to look into that. Of course, if you get where, say, both the father's mother and the mother's mother had the same name, then you start running into complications because you shouldn't have two Marys in the family. But Mary Ann, Mary Sophia, might be sufficiently different. You'd have to, of course, first you have to look to see if that's even a possibility. Another thing that I didn't mention with the names is when you get into the 19th century, for both boys and girls, one of the things that is kind of a saving grace with the Scots is they started giving their kids middle names, and many, many, many times in the case of both the girls and the boys, that middle name was not what I'd call a Christian name. Instead, it was a surname that had been passed down in the family, so that my great-grandmother, for example, who I just knew as Annie McPherson, when I found her birth record, it turned out her name was actually Anne McCallum McPherson. And that was new to me. I'd never heard of the McCallum before. And it turned out she came by the name, honestly, if you will. She was named for a grandmother whose name was Anne White McCallum. And it all goes back to that original Anne White that married the William Wallace in 1770. So these names proliferate. So when you see a boy or you have an ancestor, you know his name was something like James Duncanson Ferguson, count that as a blessing because there are going to be a lot of James Fergusons. There might actually be a number of James Duncanson Fergusons, but not that many. And knowing that and the fact that the Scots were really particular about their names, that finding that might help you to pinpoint your guy or your woman. Yes.
One thing I didn't understand when my mother would say, well, we want to hear about the McCallums. So one side of her family was McCallums, the other side was McCallums too. So she had a problem when she went to school. The teacher asked her, what is your name? What was your mother's name? What was your father's name?
Right.
But I did find out when we went over to Scotland that MC McCallum is of Irish heritage, and MAC Callum is the son of Callum. Is that true?
That is not true. I heard that same story. No, that's not true at all. MC, MAC, it doesn't matter. It can be Scottish, can be Irish. Most of my Scottish people are MCs. My McPhersons, my McCallums, it's all just MC, and it does mean son of, whether it's Mick or Mac. And you'll see the same families that will sometimes have it with the MC, and some will have. I have cousins whose name is McMillan, And all of a sudden they added, they went from McMillan to Macmillan, which is what they are now. But I know it's the same people.
Does that mean anything?
Well, just the MC just is son of. It's a patronymic.
But why would they have MAC or MC or?
It's just their preference. Just a preference. Yeah, it doesn't mean anything. Yeah. Well, it's been a real pleasure to have you all here. I appreciate the audience very much, and I apologize for the microphone mix-up at the beginning. I hope you were able to hear it and take something of this with you. Thank you.